The cross did not begin as a symbol of hope, faith, or redemption. It began as a calculated instrument of terror, engineered by one of history's most efficient empires to erase dignity, prolong agony, and broadcast power. Long before it appeared on church walls, necklaces, and flags, the cross was something people feared to see on the horizon, because it meant the state had decided not only to kill someone, but to make an example of them. What makes this story unsettling is not just how brutal the cross was, but how something designed to destroy identity was later transformed into one of the most recognizable symbols on earth. That transformation did not happen by accident, and understanding it requires slowing down, setting aside assumptions, and looking carefully at what history, archaeology, and the biblical text actually say, without exaggeration and without reverence or hostility clouding the facts. Crucifixion was not invented by Christians, nor by Jews, nor even by the Romans themselves. Historical sources indicate that variations of crucifixion were practiced earlier by groups such as the Assyrians and Persians, but it was Rome that refined it into a systematic form of execution. Roman writers like Cicero described crucifixion as the most cruel and disgusting punishment imaginable, something so degrading that it should not even be mentioned in polite conversation. This was not because Romans were especially sensitive, but because crucifixion violated every social boundary. It was slow, public, humiliating, and intentionally theatrical. Victims were stripped, exposed, mocked, and left to die over hours or days while crowds passed by. The suffering was not a side effect, it was the point. Rome used crucifixion selectively. Roman citizens were generally exempt, except in cases of extreme treason. The cross was reserved for slaves, rebels, pirates, and those considered threats to public order. In other words, it was a tool of control. The message was simple and brutally effective. This is what happens when you challenge Rome. This is what happens when you step outside the system. The cross spoke before any words were needed, and it spoke in a language everyone understood. The Gospels do not sanitize this reality. In fact, they assume the audience already understands how horrifying crucifixion is. That is why the New Testament rarely describes the physical mechanics of Jesus' death in detail. There is no need to explain what nails do to flesh, or how suffocation occurs when the body collapses under its own weight. Ancient readers knew. What the biblical text focuses on instead is the meaning assigned to the event, not the method itself. This distinction matters because later Christian tradition would increasingly collapse the two, turning the instrument into the message. In the first-century Jewish context, crucifixion carried an additional layer of meaning. According to Deuteronomy 21:23, anyone who is hung on a tree is under God's curse. This passage did not originally refer to Roman crucifixion, but to post-execution exposure of a body. Yet the association was clear enough that crucifixion implied divine rejection. For a Jewish audience, the idea of a crucified Messiah was not just shocking, it was offensive. This helps explain why Paul later wrote in 1 Corinthians 1:23 that we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. He was not using poetic language, he was describing a genuine cultural collision. Jesus' execution followed standard Roman procedure. The Gospels agree on the essential elements. He was sentenced by a Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate. He was flogged, mocked by soldiers, forced to carry the crossbeam, and executed outside the city. A sign indicating the charge against him was affixed above his head. These details align with what is known from Roman sources and archaeology. The New Testament does not present crucifixion as a symbolic abstraction. It presents it as a real execution carried out by imperial authority. What is often overlooked is that the earliest followers of Jesus did not immediately turn the cross into a visual symbol. For decades, Christians avoided depicting it altogether. This hesitation makes sense. The cross was too closely associated with shame and defeat. Early Christian art, such as that found in the Roman catacombs, favors symbols like the fish, the shepherd, or the anchor. When the cross does appear, it is often disguised or stylized, stripped of its explicit violence. This was not a theological oversight, it was a social reality. The shift begins gradually, and it is inseparable from power. When Christianity moved from a persecuted minority to an institution tolerated and later favored by the Roman state, the meaning of the cross began to change. By the 4th century, after Emperor Constantine's conversion and the Edict of Milan, crucifixion itself was abolished as a form of execution. Only then could the cross safely be reimagined. Once it no longer functioned as a real threat, it became available for reinterpretation. This reinterpretation did not come from nowhere. The New Testament already contained theological frameworks that reframed the cross as purposeful rather than accidental. The Gospel of Mark presents Jesus predicting his death multiple times. The Gospel of John portrays the crucifixion as an act of exaltation, not merely suffering. Paul's letters describe the cross as a site of reconciliation, where sin and death are confronted. These interpretations are internal to the biblical text, not later inventions. However, theology and symbolism are not the same thing. Belief does not automatically translate to branding. As Christianity expanded across the Roman world, the cross became increasingly visible. It appeared in architecture, in liturgy, in personal devotion. Over time, it also became a marker of identity. To wear or display a cross was to signal belonging. This is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable for some, because symbols do not remain neutral. They accumulate layers of meaning shaped by culture, politics, and economics. By the medieval period, the cross had become central to Christian imagery, but not always in ways that reflected the historical reality of crucifixion. Artistic representations often softened the brutality, emphasizing serenity over agony. This aesthetic shift made the cross more approachable, but it also distanced it from its origins. At the same time, the cross was increasingly used to legitimize authority. Crusaders marched under it, kings ruled by it, institutions claimed divine sanction through it. The instrument of Roman execution had become a banner. None of this requires the assumption of malicious intent. Cultural transformation rarely does. Symbols evolve because they are useful, adaptable, and emotionally resonant. The cross was all three. It condensed suffering, sacrifice, victory, and identity into a single image. That made it powerful, and power always attracts structure, repetition, and eventually commodification. In modern times, the cross exists simultaneously as a religious symbol, a fashion accessory, a political marker, and a commercial product. It can be found in luxury jewelry stores, street markets, album covers, and advertising campaigns. For some, it represents deep personal faith. For others, it is purely aesthetic. These uses are not inherently contradictory, but they do raise a question that often goes unasked. How did an execution device designed to erase meaning become something that generates meaning at such scale? The Bible itself offers no command to display the cross. There is no instruction in the Gospels or the letters to use it as an emblem. The focus is consistently on the event, not the object. Jesus speaks of taking up one's cross metaphorically, referring to self-denial and suffering, not to visual symbolism. This distinction matters because it shows that the prominence of the cross as a symbol is a historical development, not a biblical mandate. At the same time, the New Testament does not discourage symbolic reflection. Paul uses the language of the cross repeatedly, not to glorify pain, but to highlight a reversal of values. What looks like weakness becomes strength, what looks like defeat becomes victory. These themes resonated deeply in a world structured by hierarchy and domination. The cross, paradoxically, became a critique of the very power that created it. And yet, that critique did not prevent the cross from being absorbed back into systems of power. History rarely moves in straight lines. What begins as resistance can become reinforcement. What begins as scandal can become standard. The transformation of the cross sits precisely at that intersection, where belief, culture, and authority collide. What makes this story compelling is not the claim that Christianity corrupted the cross, nor that Rome unintentionally created a symbol of salvation. Those are simplifications. The reality is more complex and more human. The cross remained what it always was in material terms: wood, nails, and death. What changed was the narrative attached to it, and narratives are shaped by who tells them, who benefits from them, and who inherits them. The question that lingers is not whether the cross was originally a Roman execution tool. That is historically uncontested. The question is what happens when an object of state terror is transformed into a symbol of faith, identity, and continuity across centuries. That transformation did not erase the past. It layered meaning on top of it, sometimes illuminating, sometimes obscuring, sometimes both at once. The moment the cross stopped being feared as an immediate sentence of death, it began to change its social gravity. That change was subtle at first, almost invisible, and it did not happen because people suddenly forgot what crucifixion was. Memory does not disappear that easily. Instead, the distance between symbol and experience widened. When no one in the street was being nailed to wood anymore, the cross could be looked at without the instinctive recoil that once accompanied it. This distance created space, and space allows meaning to be reshaped. The earliest Christian writers were acutely aware of how dangerous that reshaping could become. This is why much of the New Testament insists on returning attention to the act rather than the object. Paul writes in Galatians 6:14, "May I never boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ." Yet even here, he is not boasting in wood or iron, but in what he understands the event to signify. He immediately reframes the cross as a point of rupture with the world's value system, not as a visual marker to be displayed. The tension is already present. Language elevates the cross, but practice remains cautious. As Christianity moved beyond its Jewish roots and spread through the Greco-Roman world, interpretation became unavoidable. Gentile converts did not share the same scriptural background or cultural associations with shame and curse. For many, the cross was simply a Roman punishment they had seen or heard about. This meant that teaching had to fill in the gaps. Over time, theological explanation did what memory alone could not. It stabilized meaning. The cross became less about how Rome killed and more about why Jesus died. This shift can be traced in how the Gospels themselves are read. The Roman method of execution fades into the background, while the fulfillment of Scripture moves forward. Passages like Isaiah 53, Psalm 22, and the imagery of the suffering servant are repeatedly linked to the crucifixion. Whether one reads these connections as prophetic fulfillment or theological interpretation, the effect is the same. The cross becomes embedded in a narrative framework that transcends its Roman origins.
But narratives do not exist in isolation. They live inside institutions. As the church organized itself, symbols became tools for continuity and instruction. In a largely illiterate society, visual language mattered. The cross, once avoided, became useful. It condensed complex theology into a single recognizable form. It communicated sacrifice, allegiance, and belonging without requiring explanation. That efficiency is part of what allowed it to spread so thoroughly. This is also where the idea of the cross as a brand begins to make sense, not in a modern marketing sense, but in a sociological one. A brand is a symbol that carries identity, trust, authority, and recognition across space and time. By the late antique period, the cross was doing exactly that. It marked buildings, communities, and eventually entire empires. To see it was to know what power structure operated there. Constantine's reported vision before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge is often cited as a turning point. According to sources like Eusebius, Constantine saw a symbol associated with Christ and the words, "By this sign, conquer." Whether this account reflects historical fact, later embellishment, or political mythology is debated. What is not debated is the outcome. The cross became associated not only with suffering, but with victory. That association changed everything. Once victory enters the picture, the cross stops being primarily a reminder of execution and becomes a sign of triumph. This reinterpretation aligns with certain New Testament themes, particularly in the Gospel of John, where Jesus' death is portrayed as a moment of glorification. Yet when triumph is emphasized without terror, something is inevitably lost. The cross becomes cleaner, safer, and easier to deploy. This deployment did not remain theological. It became territorial. Churches were built in the shape of the cross. Cities were claimed in its name. Armies marched under it. These developments were not dictated by Scripture, but they were justified using Scripture. Passages about spiritual warfare and divine authority were read through the lens of institutional power. The symbol absorbed those meanings because it could. It is important to pause here and resist the temptation to flatten this process into cynicism. Symbols do not manipulate people on their own. People use symbols because they already resonate. The cross resonated because the story attached to it addressed real human concerns. Suffering, injustice, death, and hope are not abstract problems. The cross spoke to them in a language that was both concrete and transcendent. At the same time, resonance does not equal restraint. Once the cross became central, it was difficult to challenge how it was used without appearing to challenge the faith itself. This fusion of symbol and belief created a protective layer. Criticism of how the cross functioned socially could be dismissed as hostility toward Christianity, even when the concern was historical or ethical rather than theological.
The Bible itself contains warnings that seem relevant here, even if they are rarely applied to symbols. In the Hebrew Scriptures, the making of physical representations tied to worship is treated with suspicion. The second commandment prohibits graven images, not because images are inherently evil, but because they tend to fix meaning, and fixed meaning can replace living relationship. Early Christianity inherited this tension, even as it gradually moved away from it. By the time the cross became a dominant visual element, that caution had largely faded. The symbol was no longer competing with idols, it was replacing them. In that sense, the cross functioned as an anti-idol that eventually became an icon. This transformation did not occur through a single decision or decree. It happened through repetition, acceptance, and normalization. The medieval period intensified this process. Theology increasingly emphasized the physical suffering of Christ, particularly in Western Christianity. Artistic representations grew more graphic, focusing on wounds, blood, and agony. This seems at first glance like a return to the horror of crucifixion. Yet it was a controlled horror, mediated by art and ritual. The violence was aestheticized, framed for contemplation rather than terror. This shift served multiple functions. It reinforced emotional devotion, encouraged empathy, and provided a focal point for penitence. It also made the cross indispensable. Salvation was imagined through it, mediated by it, and accessed by proximity to it. Relics, pilgrimage sites, and liturgical reenactments all revolved around the crucifixion narrative. The cross was no longer just remembered, it was reenacted. Throughout this period, biblical language was consistently invoked. Jesus' words from the cross, recorded in the Gospels, were layered with theological meaning. My God, why have you forsaken me?" was linked to Psalm 22. It is finished was interpreted as the completion of redemptive work. These interpretations are rooted in the text, but how they were visualized and ritualized went far beyond what the text describes. As Europe moved toward the modern era, the cross did not lose prominence, it adapted. With the rise of nation-states, it became part of flags and emblems. With the Reformation, debates erupted over how the cross should be represented, or whether it should be represented at all. Iconoclasm was not merely about art, it was about authority. Who gets to define what the cross means? Even in movements that rejected images, the language of the cross remained central. Sermons, hymns, and confessions emphasized it as the core of the gospel. The object might be removed from view, but the concept remained dominant. This demonstrates an important point. The power of the cross does not depend entirely on its physical form. It depends on the story people tell about it. In the modern globalized world, that story fragments. The cross circulates faster than its explanations. It appears in contexts far removed from theology. Fashion strips it of explicit meaning. Politics weaponizes it. Entertainment uses it for atmosphere or provocation. None of this requires belief. The symbol functions because recognition is enough. Here, the idea of branding becomes difficult to ignore. A brand does not require understanding, it requires familiarity. The cross has achieved that at a level few symbols ever have. This does not automatically cheapen it, but it does complicate it. When a symbol can mean everything, it risks meaning nothing. The Bible does not resolve this tension. It was not written to anticipate a world where the cross would be mass-produced and globally circulated. What it does offer is a consistent return to the narrative of execution and resurrection, not as spectacle, but as confrontation. The cross confronts power, violence, and certainty. Whether that confrontation survives its transformation into a symbol is an open question. What cannot be denied is that the cross's journey from Roman execution tool to universal emblem required forgetting as much as remembering. Certain aspects were preserved, others muted. The state terror that once defined crucifixion rarely features in modern reflection. The humiliation, the political message, the warning to rebels, these elements are often absent. In their place stand abstraction and devotion. This selective memory is not unique to Christianity. Cultures regularly repurpose instruments of violence into symbols of identity. What makes the cross distinctive is the scale and endurance of that repurposing. It has outlived the empire that created it. It has crossed linguistic, cultural, and ideological boundaries, and in doing so, it has accumulated meanings that sometimes sit uneasily beside one another. The unresolved tension remains. Can a symbol born in execution retain its critical edge once it becomes familiar? Can it challenge power when it is aligned with power? These are not questions the Bible answers directly, but they are questions the Bible provokes, especially when read alongside the historical reality of crucifixion. The cross was never neutral. It was designed to communicate a message. The only question is whose message it communicates now, and how that message is received depends largely on how much of its origin is allowed to remain visible. As the cross moved deeper into everyday life, something subtle but decisive happened. It stopped being encountered primarily as a story and began to be encountered as an object. Objects invite different kinds of relationships. They can be touched, worn, displayed, inherited. They move silently through generations, often detached from the explanations that once surrounded them. This is not a moral judgment, it is a historical pattern. Meaning travels more slowly than form. By the early modern period, most people encountering a cross were no longer thinking about Roman law, public deterrence, or imperial terror. They were encountering an inherited symbol already saturated with interpretation. The cross arrived preloaded with assumptions. It meant Christianity, it meant morality, it meant sacred authority. The original function of the cross, as a warning issued by the state to the powerless, had largely disappeared from popular consciousness.
This disappearance matters because the Roman use of crucifixion was never random, it was public by design. Executions were staged in visible places, often along roads or outside city gates, precisely so that movement, commerce, and daily life would pass by suffering bodies. Josephus describes mass crucifixions during periods of rebellion, where crosses became so numerous that space ran out for wood and victims. This was not about justice in the modern sense, it was about visibility and fear. When the Gospels place Jesus' crucifixion outside Jerusalem's walls, they are not offering poetic symbolism, they are describing standard Roman practice. Hebrews 13:12 later reflects on this detail, noting that Jesus suffered outside the gate, linking his execution to rejection and exclusion. The text assumes that readers understand what being placed outside means socially and politically. That assumption weakens when the cross becomes abstract. As centuries pass, abstraction increases. The cross is simplified into lines and shapes. Its proportions are refined. Its surface is polished. Eventually, it becomes elegant. This aesthetic evolution is not accidental. Symbols that endure must adapt to taste. But as they adapt, they also filter reality. An elegant cross does not immediately communicate suffocation, dehydration, or prolonged agony. It communicates balance and symmetry. The Bible does not aestheticize crucifixion. Even when it avoids graphic description, it preserves discomfort. The mockery, the taunts, the abandonment, the inscription declaring Jesus King of the Jews all reinforce the political nature of the execution. Rome crucified Jesus not for theological claims, but for perceived insurrection. The charge was kingship. The cross was Rome's response to rival authority. This political dimension often recedes behind theological emphasis, yet it remains embedded in the text. When Pilate asks, "Are you the King of the Jews?" he is not asking a spiritual question. He is asking whether Jesus represents a threat to Roman order. The cross answers that question in Rome's language. The execution says, "This is how Rome deals with kings who do not belong to Rome." As the cross becomes detached from this context, it becomes easier to use it in ways that align with authority rather than challenge it. Once a symbol no longer reminds people of how power kills, it can be comfortably displayed by power. This is one of the most striking reversals in the history of symbols. An object created to enforce dominance becomes an emblem worn by rulers. This reversal does not require conspiracy, it requires time. Over generations, stories are compressed, memories curated. The aspects of the cross that trouble stability are softened. What remains is what integrates easily into social order. The cross becomes a sign of peace rather than execution, of belonging rather than exclusion. Yet traces of the original meaning never disappear completely. They surface in moments of tension. When the cross is used to justify violence, critics point out the contradiction. When it is commercialized, others feel discomfort without always knowing why. These reactions suggest that something unresolved still lingers beneath the surface.
The New Testament itself contains a warning that feels relevant here. In Philippians 2, Paul describes Jesus' death on a cross as the ultimate act of humiliation, followed by exaltation. The movement is downward before it is upward. Humility precedes authority. When that sequence is reversed, when exaltation dominates without humiliation, the logic of the text is disrupted. The cross becomes a shortcut to glory rather than a confrontation with loss. This disruption becomes visible in how the cross is taught. In many contexts, the emphasis rests almost entirely on what the cross accomplishes rather than what it exposes. It accomplishes forgiveness, reconciliation, salvation. These themes are deeply biblical. But the cross also exposes the mechanics of injustice, the fragility of innocence, and the ease with which crowds participate in violence. These themes are equally biblical, yet less comfortable. The gospel accounts include multiple groups who participate in the crucifixion without seeing themselves as villains. Religious leaders act to preserve stability. Roman officials act to maintain order. Crowds follow momentum. Soldiers follow commands. The cross reveals how ordinary systems produce extraordinary cruelty. This aspect of the story becomes muted when the cross is reduced to a logo. Logos are powerful precisely because they simplify. They allow complex systems to be represented instantly. When the cross functions this way, it gains efficiency but loses friction. Friction is what forces reflection. Without it, symbols slide into the background, reinforcing rather than interrogating the structures they inhabit. The Bible never treats the cross as background. It remains an interruption. Even resurrection does not erase crucifixion. The risen Jesus in the Gospels still bears wounds. This detail is not incidental. It preserves continuity between execution and vindication. The scars insist that power did not disappear, it was exposed. As Christianity spread beyond Europe, the cross encountered new cultures and histories. In colonial contexts, it often arrived alongside conquest. Missionaries carried it, sometimes sincerely, sometimes alongside imperial agendas. For indigenous populations, the cross could signify both spiritual promise and cultural destruction. These experiences layered new meanings onto the symbol, often far removed from first-century Judea. Again, this does not require assuming uniform intent. Individuals believed what they preached, institutions pursued what they valued, symbols absorbed the outcome. The cross became associated with education, medicine, oppression, resistance, and adaptation depending on context, its meaning fractured without disappearing. In some regions, the cross became a site of protest rather than compliance. Liberation theologians emphasized the crucified Christ as identification with the poor and oppressed. Here, the cross reclaimed some of its original edge. It confronted unjust power rather than legitimizing it. This interpretation draws directly from biblical themes, particularly the identification of Jesus with the marginalized.
This demonstrates that the cross never fully settles. It can be reactivated. Its meaning can be contested. But contestation requires memory. It requires remembering that the cross was not a neutral religious artifact, but a mechanism of state violence. Without that memory, reinterpretation risks becoming repetition. Modern media accelerates this risk. Images circulate faster than explanations. A cross on a screen or product does not carry footnotes. It relies on recognition alone. This is efficient, but it flattens depth. Over time, familiarity replaces understanding. The Bible itself anticipates this danger in a different register. Prophets repeatedly warn against empty symbols disconnected from justice. Sacrifices, festivals, and rituals lose meaning when they no longer correspond to ethical reality. While the cross is not addressed in this context, the principle applies. Symbols detached from practice become hollow. This hollowness is not always obvious. It often feels like comfort. Familiar symbols reassure. They signal continuity in a changing world. The cross offers that reassurance at a deep level. It promises that suffering has meaning, that death is not final. These promises are powerful. They explain why the cross persists. But persistence does not guarantee coherence. A symbol can endure while its internal tensions grow. The cross holds together execution and hope, terror and trust, state violence and divine purpose. These elements do not naturally harmonize. They require interpretation, and interpretation reflects values. What becomes clear is that the cross cannot be understood fully if it is isolated from the system that produced it. Rome did not invent crucifixion as a theological metaphor. It invented it as a warning. Christianity did not adopt the cross because it was visually compelling. It inherited it because its central figure died on one. Everything else followed. Once that inheritance was accepted, the question was never whether the cross would change, but how. Would it remain an accusation against violent power, or would it be absorbed into power's vocabulary? History shows that it has done both, often simultaneously. The Bible preserves this ambiguity rather than resolving it. The cross is described as foolishness and power, weakness and victory. These paradoxes resist simplification. When the symbol is simplified anyway, something essential is lost, even if something else is gained. Understanding the cross as a Roman execution tool does not strip it of religious meaning. It anchors that meaning. It prevents drift into abstraction. It reminds the listener that faith emerged not in comfort, but in confrontation with the machinery of death. This discomfort this creates is not a flaw, it is the point. The cross was never meant to be easy to look at, easy to wear, or easy to explain. Its later transformation into something familiar and manageable raises a final tension that cannot be ignored. Has familiarity dulled the very force that once made the cross unforgettable? That tension sets the stage for the last layer of this story, where meaning, memory, and modern identity collide in ways that are impossible to ignore.
By the time the cross reaches the modern world, it no longer arrives empty. It arrives carrying centuries of interpretation, conflict, devotion, and contradiction. It enters societies that did not witness crucifixions, that do not live under Roman law, and that often experience power through institutions far removed from public executions. In this setting, the cross becomes something else again, not because its past disappears, but because its past competes with present needs. One of the defining features of modernity is distance. Distance from ancient violence, distance from imperial punishments, distance from the physical reality of execution. Death is hidden behind hospital walls, punishment is bureaucratized, suffering is mediated through screens. In such a world, the cross is unlikely to be felt as an execution device. It is encountered as an idea before it is ever felt as a threat. This distance allows the cross to function smoothly as an identity marker. It can be worn without explanation. It can be placed on buildings without discomfort. It can be referenced politically without immediate resistance. This ease is precisely what distinguishes the modern cross from the Roman one. The Roman cross disrupted public life. The modern cross often blends into it. Yet the biblical text resists this blending. The New Testament does not present the cross as a stabilizing force. It presents it as a rupture. The crucifixion interrupts expectations, exposes injustice, and destabilizes certainty. Jesus' death does not resolve conflict neatly. It intensifies it. The resurrection narratives that follow do not erase fear. They coexist with it. The scars remain visible. This persistence of wounds is one of the most overlooked elements of the gospel accounts. The risen Jesus is recognizable not because he looks healed, but because he still bears the marks of execution. This detail anchors resurrection in history rather than myth. It insists that transformation does not require forgetting. The cross remains present even when its meaning shifts. Modern Christianity often struggles with this insistence. There is a strong impulse to move quickly from crucifixion to resurrection, from suffering to victory, from death to hope. These movements are deeply rooted in the biblical narrative, but when accelerated, they risk bypassing what the cross reveals about power. Rome is rarely named in contemporary reflection. Execution becomes theological rather than political. Violence becomes abstract rather than systemic. This abstraction creates room for selective appropriation. The cross can be used to support narratives of personal salvation while remaining silent about collective injustice. It can symbolize moral order without confronting how moral order has historically been enforced. It can comfort individuals while leaving structures untouched.
The Bible does not permit this silence easily. The Gospels situate the cross within a web of authority, fear, and compromise. Pilate knows Jesus is innocent and executes him anyway. Religious leaders fear losing influence. Crowds shift allegiance rapidly. None of these dynamics belong exclusively to the ancient world. They are recurring patterns. The cross exposes them without naming them comfortable. When the cross becomes a brand, this exposure weakens. Branding prioritizes consistency, recognizability, and emotional resonance. It simplifies complexity to ensure transmission. These are not inherently negative qualities. They are how symbols survive. But survival comes at a cost. The sharper edges are sanded down. The unsettling questions are replaced with reassuring answers. This is why the language of branding feels uncomfortable when applied to religious symbols. It suggests intention, strategy, and packaging. Yet branding does not require conscious design to occur. It emerges when symbols are repeated, standardized, and detached from context. The cross meets all these conditions. It appears in predictable forms. It communicates belonging instantly. It signals trustworthiness in certain environments. These functions mirror those of modern brands, even if their origins differ. The cross has become reliable. Reliability is not neutral. It shapes expectation. What the Bible consistently disrupts is reliability. Jesus does not behave predictably. His execution does not follow the logic of success. His resurrection does not produce immediate clarity. The cross within the text refuses to become manageable. It resists closure. This resistance is most visible in how the early Christian message was received. Paul's insistence on preaching Christ crucified was not a strategy for growth, it was a liability. It alienated Jews and confused Gentiles. It did not align with cultural aspirations. That it spread anyway says less about marketing and more about the power of paradox. As the paradox becomes familiar, it loses shock. Familiarity dulls offense. This is not unique to Christianity. All enduring narratives face the same risk. What begins as disruption becomes tradition. What begins as scandal becomes symbol. The question then is not whether the cross has been transformed. That is undeniable. The question is whether something essential has been obscured in the process. Has the cross ceased to function as a critique of violence because it has been absorbed into the language of identity? Has it become easier to display than to wrestle with? The Bible does not provide a final answer, but it does provide a framework for asking the question honestly. It insists that the cross is not merely something to be believed, but something to be confronted. Jesus' call to take up one's cross is not an invitation to adopt a symbol. It is an invitation to accept cost, loss, and vulnerability.
This call is uncomfortable precisely because it cannot be branded. It cannot be mass-produced without distortion. It resists efficiency. It resists control. When the cross becomes too efficient, too polished, too safe, it risks betraying its origin. Understanding the cross as a Roman execution tool does not undermine Christian faith, it clarifies it. It grounds theological claims in historical reality. It forces reflection on how power operates, how violence is normalized, and how easily meaning shifts when symbols outlive their context. Christianity did not invent the cross, Rome did. Christianity inherited it because its central figure died under Roman authority. Everything that followed was interpretation, negotiation, and adaptation. Some of that adaptation preserved the tension, some of it dissolved it. The cross today stands at the intersection of faith and familiarity. It is everywhere, and because it is everywhere, it risks being unseen. Recovering its weight does not require rejecting it, but remembering it, remembering what it was designed to do, remembering who it was meant to terrify, remembering that it was never neutral. The Bible's insistence on returning to the cross again and again is not an invitation to sentimentalize it. It is a warning against forgetting what it reveals. Forgetting allows symbols to drift. Remembering restores friction. In that friction lies the enduring power of the cross, not as a brand, not as decoration, not as a shorthand for belief, but as a confrontation with how systems kill, how crowds comply, and how meaning is reclaimed from instruments of death. If this perspective challenged you, unsettled you, or made you see a familiar symbol differently, take a moment to engage. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment sharing how you understand the cross today, not just as a symbol, but as a historical reality. Your engagement helps keep conversations like this alive, visible, and honest.